So thank you all for coming very much. We appreciate your attendance. And I personally appreciate you all being here so that I'm speaking to some people who are really very interested in Sterling Brown. We really appreciate that. So I want to thank a few people, though, before I give you my remarks. I know my friend will tell me that there's no need to get into all of that, but this has been quite a labor of love, and a lot of people have helped us to make this happen. And I want to thank them before I do anything or say anything else. I want to certainly thank my good friend and mentor. I've known him since I was in my 20s. I won't tell you how old I am now, so don't ask. But he was one of the first poets that I met in this city, and he has been a true friend and supporter for all these years, and that's Ethelbert Miller. He is the co-curator of this event, the Poetry and Folklore of Sterling Brown, a historical examination and celebration of a cultural legend. And I will say, without him and several other people that I'm going to mention, we might not be here today. Certainly, we thank Sterling for his life and his legacy and what he contributed to not just Washington, D.C., but all of American literature. My deepest gratitude, as I said, goes to my friend Ethelbert Miller. I want to thank our funders, Loy Nimhart from the Humanities, the DC, HumanitiesDC is here. I want to thank HumanitiesDC and the team that's there, Hillary Steen, Leah Gage, and the executive director, Rebecca Otero. And I wanted to name them simply because we all know what has been going on with the federal government. And in the middle of us, Ethelbert and I, planning this event, the Humanities Council received a letter from the NEH indicating that all grants had to be rescinded. They somehow managed to fund the grants, to continue for this grant year to fund us. Ethelbert and I were actually preparing to send notes to the people who had agreed to speak because we thought we'd have to not do this. And so I have the utmost respect and gratitude for HumanitiesDC for what the magic that they did. So it's just amazing. We also want to thank Carrie S. Pearson, who is a longtime supporter of Esther Productions, Luger Trust, who just became a supporter of Esther Productions last year, supporting our Midnight Rose, a reading series of poetry and prose. And so we want to thank them. Emmanuel Bailey with the Vital Services Corporation, A. Scott Bolden, who was supposed to be here to actually do greetings and was called away for work with Morehouse. He's on the board of Morehouse. I am extremely grateful to Lisa Conathan and Julia Rossi, who I think are over there with Williams. They will come up later and have a few words to say. But when we started this project, and as I always do, I get all involved in the research, and so I did that, and I thought, let me call them up and see. And they were so helpful with providing us with photographs and correspondence with the things that I requested, and I absolutely am going to race to the archives when the spring comes, because I hate the winter in, who loves the winter in New England? I don't know how you all do it. But so I'm going to definitely go to the archives. I recommend that you do that as well, but I'll let them talk about their archives and talk about what they have of Sterling Brown. They have some fabulous, fabulous materials. Much appreciation to Our team, especially Sierra Fisher, who was our associate events director, thanks to Thomas Dow, who had put up with me for what? I don't know. He probably is ready. He'll be happy when this day is over. He's the conference director here, and of course we made quite a few requests, and he helped us and guided us, so we are very thankful to him for his help, and to Trinity University. Initially, when I was considering a project that focused on Sterling A. Brown, DC's first poet laureate, Howard University professor for 40 years, and a rock star in the literary community, I declared his work the precursor to rap. Who could read the Odyssey of Big Boy and not see and hear LL Cool J, for example? While that may have been and still is a worthy exploration, I believed it might limit the perception of Sterling Brown, the understanding of his reach, the full appreciation of his creative, cultural, and intellectual depth. So I abandoned that, at least for now, for what you will hear today. During the next several hours, as some of the country's most esteemed scholars and writers guide your exploration on a man the Washington Post Joseph McClellan called one of the most significant writers of American literature in the 20th century. To put a fine point on that characterization, remember that Big Boy and Strong Men were written and first published in 1927. Though some people have suggested that Brown was a minor player in the Negro movement, the New Negro movement, the fact is he shaped that movement and every subsequent cultural, political movement that followed, not only with his own poems and essays, but also through his criticism. Equally important, he developed the minds and talents of individuals who would become some of the country's most distinguished thought leaders and creatives. Even as he aged and seemed to be off the stage, Sterling Brown was influencing the arts and influencing the players. That desire is what partially drove me, the political and cultural environment in which we find ourselves also inspired me. We face a government that is engaged in distorting our history, in muting voices, and flagrant cultural cleansing. Sterling Brown, the poet, the critic, the folklorist, the teacher, the cultural revolutionary, faced such challenges. He stood toe-to-toe, refusing to be silent and refusing to be compromised. He taught us through his life and literary legacy not just to fight, but also to celebrate ourselves. How to celebrate the extraordinary contributions of ordinary people, creating a greater appreciation for folklore and oral tradition. Sterling Brown is definitely worthy of our attention, protection, and advancement. So thank you for joining us today, as Esther Productions begins its effort to take Sterling Brown into schools and communities through the Sterling Brown Education Project. If any of you are here who would like to be engaged in that effort, please leave your name at the sign-in sheet at the registration table. This is phase 2 of Esther Productions Inc.'s DC Literary History Project. Some of you were here last year when we focused on African American authors of children's literature. So thank you for your active and physical presence and involvement, and for your financial support. Now let's move on to the next speaker. And that next speaker is Lisa Conathan with Williams Special Collections. I mentioned to you that A. Scott Bolden wouldn't be here. So Lisa, please come up and share with us your story about Sterling Brown and his collection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the people who made this event possible today, especially Jonetta Barras and Ethelbert Miller, who have been such enthusiastic catalysts to bring us all together today and celebrate Sterling Brown. As Jonetta mentioned, I'm visiting with my colleague Julia Rossi from Williams College, and we're really happy to share information about the Sterling Brown papers and other collections at Williams College. When I was coming down by train yesterday from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C., I couldn't help but think about what Sterling Brown's journey in the opposite direction might have felt like. What was it like for him to go from the busy city of Washington to a rural, small town in Western Massachusetts in the fall of 1918? We might be used to thinking of Sterling Brown as a fully formed intellectual of formidable reputation, but at that moment, he was a teenager. When he set out for Williams College, he wouldn't turn 18 until the spring of his freshman year. The president of Williams College had an agreement with Dunbar High School to provide a pipeline for selected students. And in the 19-teens and 1920s, there were several Dunbar graduates who attended Williams. Amherst College, by the way, had a similar agreement with Dunbar. And for some reason, Amherst was recruiting the star athletes and Williams was recruiting the academics. Not really sure why. Sterling Brown was one of those students, and he headed north during a time of massive global upheaval and uncertainty. A flu pandemic was in full swing. I believe that moment was the deadliest second wave of that flu pandemic, and it was targeting especially young and healthy people like college students. Large gatherings had been canceled, and there was a serious concern for public health in the air. That whole first year he was on campus, there were no football games, the movie theaters were closed because of the pandemic. In the fall of 1918, the First World War was raging in France and in Macedonia. American soldiers were going overseas, including about 90% of the Williams College class of 1917. Williams College had the highest rate of participation in the First World War of any college or university in the United States. So we can only imagine how that impacted the culture of campus that year when he arrived, and how empty the campus might have felt with so many people off at war, and how profoundly that would have impacted his experience. We look back now and we know that that was the moment when the tide was turning in the war and peace was coming soon, but he had no way of knowing that Armistice Day was only a couple months away. When he arrived in Williamstown, it was a very unusual start to an undergraduate career. The Williams campus had been transformed into a military training ground through the Student Army Training Corps. And Brown was, for a few months, a private in the United States Army. He wore a military uniform, and instead of studying English and math and Latin, he studied battlefield tactics and other military topics. Thankfully, Armistice Day did come, and a military career was not in the cards for him. He rejoiced at the end of the war not only to celebrate peace, as everyone did, but because his real studies could begin. He went on to have mixed experiences at Williams College, a community that in the 19-teens and 1920s had very rigid ideas of what was expected of its small number of African American students. Academic excellence and intellectual achievement were accepted, social parity and integration were not. He did return decades later to receive an honorary degree, and his legacy is now widely recognized and celebrated at Williams College. Speaking personally, this history of racial segregation at Williams brings a special urgency to our care of his collections. We in the library are truly honored to be the stewards of Sterling Brown's papers, his personal library, and his collection of records. We're especially grateful to the generosity of his family for entrusting this gift to Williams in 2019. Williams is primarily an undergraduate teaching institution. And since 2019, this collection has been in constant use to support teaching of history, literature, and Africana studies. It's one of the collections most often requested by faculty to use in library instruction. We in the library have the special satisfaction of seeing Williams students connect with Sterling Brown, not only as a published author, but also as a fellow Williams student and as a human being, as they can discover aspects of his life through his papers, his photographs, and other collections. So now, and I think at this gathering, it's really the first time we can very publicly say that his papers are definitively open for research. Not that work on them doesn't continue. On Thursday, as I was leaving, I saw that we had cataloged 7,985 books that he owned, and we continue to catalog more. By now, we might have reached 8,000. There was a student working on it as I left the office. There are 8 series or subgroups of his papers that have been processed, which include the social research group. And that includes not only, I think, his well-known work with the Works Progress Administration, but also his affiliation with the Myrdal study, which is a Swedish social research study. His correspondence, both personal and professional. His teaching materials from classes he taught at Howard and also other visiting appointments at other universities. Personal and family papers, photographs, financial records, and writings that include poetry, fiction, criticism, and essays. There are a lot of drafts of many things that were later published. Other material that's still in process includes writings of others, so that's manuscripts that people sent to him to ask him to read, posthumous material about posthumous publications, artifacts and objects, including a box of pipes, and collected ephemera, which is all of the little things that don't fit into any of those categories. So we very enthusiastically welcome researchers who want to use the papers and other materials. We're open year-round, with a few holiday exceptions, of course, and we encourage anyone who wants to know more about conducting research with the papers to talk to me or to my colleague Julia here today, or to follow up with us by email. Our contact information is readily available on the Williams College Library website. We also have the ability to make scans of collection material free of charge. There are certain parts of the collection where we already have digital copies, and so those we can provide very quickly. Examples would be some of the photographs that are featured today. Whereas if it's a new request, it would take a few weeks. And additionally, we have a fund to sponsor travel fellowships to support use of the collection. So keep an eye out in the spring for a call for projects that can be carried out in the next academic year. There's so much to discover in this collection, whether it's more on the personal level, his many, many letters to his wife, Daisy, or documentation of the deep professional networks he cultivated, and we're really excited to see where the scholarly conversation leads us. So to conclude, Julie and I would be really happy to talk to anyone about potential visits or answer any questions you might have about the collections. Just find us during one of the breaks or during lunch today, or follow up with us after today. Thanks so much.
We're going to move to our next group of speakers. I wanted us to have some poetry of Sterling before we got started. Terry, when she does her panel, will bring that to us. So she had mentioned that she wants to do that, so we will do that then. Meanwhile, I would like to ask Ethelbert to now come up to the microphone and begin the round of introductions of our major speakers. Thank you, Ethelbert.
Thank you, Jeanette. When I was teaching in the Benedictine Writing Seminars, I would often ask my students to talk about their literary family. What writer would they claim as father, mother, or grandparents? Who would they consider to be their sister or brother? The purpose of the exercise was to make a student aware of the importance of family, to make the student aware of tradition. What writers gave them their beginnings? What writers did they love? As we begin this conference celebrating and examining the life and career of Sterling A. Brown, we begin by talking about family, the folk. We are blessed to have with us today Laura Dennis, Sterling Brown's youngest granddaughter. Laura Dennis was born and raised in Washington, D.C. She and her three sisters often enjoyed weekends with their grandparents, Sterling and Daisy, and their great aunts. Family bonds around the strong man grew stronger over the years turning into seasons. Laura lived with Sterling in his final years. She's a keeper of family stories and memories. Many of us saw Sterling Brown as a teacher, poet, and critic. But Sterling Brown was also a husband, a father, and a grandfather. I'm happy that Laura is here to remind us that Sterling Brown continues to live in all of us. Caring for our elders can be filled with challenges, but it is also very rewarding. It teaches one to be patient and kind. It teaches one how to listen. It reminds us how to love. Too often we read books forgetting that writers live beyond the page. They live inside us. We carry them with us. Laura Dennis' presence here lifts us up into amazing grace. She continues to live the legacy of Sterling Brown through her interest in young people and education. She's a board member of the Montgomery County, Maryland NAACP. She's a technical sales executive in the IT industry. Her career in technology complements her community service. Please welcome Laura Dennis as this morning begins with her warmth and glowing light. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. All right. Good morning. I am of the age I have to wear glasses now, so I apologize. I also have my daughter here, who is Sterling's great-granddaughter, Giselle, and she's going to be my media assistant. So it is an honor to be part of the celebration of Sterling's legacy. I really want to express my heartfelt thanks to both Jonetta, Barras, and Ethelbert Miller for reaching out to me and inviting me and our family to share our perspective today. And of course, I want to thank all of the generous sponsors of the program, Esther Productions, HumanitiesDC, KSP LLC, Luger Trust, Louis Shrensky, A. Scott Bolden, and David Janarone. We know that this wouldn't be possible without their support. My family and I are also deeply grateful to the head of Williams College Special Collections, Lisa Conathan, and her staff, including Julia Rossi, who's present today, for their dedication in preserving Sterling's papers and memorabilia. It's really important to us that that is preserved for future generations, and we know they're taking wonderful care of that. Sterling would be really honored to know that future generations of researchers and scholars continue to discover and learn from his remarkable work and legacy, and that cadre of writing about Sterling is growing thanks to Williams College. So thank you very much. Finally, I do want to say I'm blessed to have my entire family here today, my three sisters here at the front table, my husband, and my daughter Giselle, who it feels particularly meaningful for her to be here. She actually came down on the train late last night from college. She is now majoring in African American Studies at Princeton University, carrying forward Sterling's legacy of scholarship and dedication to African American culture and literature. She's a beautiful writer, as Sterling was. And Sterling would be so excited to know that she's carrying on his legacy. As Sterling would say, "Lottie, Lottie." She actually told me not to do that. When we study historical figures, especially influential African American intellectuals, we often focus on their public achievements and scholarly contributions. But to truly understand someone like Sterling A. Brown, who was a very personable figure, we must also see him through the lens of family. While you'll hear much today about Sterling's academic legacy as a member of the family, I'll share the story that we knew. That the family man, the storyteller, the son, the father, the husband, the grandfather, and even the great-grandfather through the stories that we're still telling our children. These intimate perspectives reveal how personal relationships shaped his writing and his teaching and his understanding of the Black experience through the stories he learned from his parents and his aunts. I'll be sharing some photos along the way that tell our story. Let me take you back to Sterling's early years. Sterling was the youngest child and only son in a family of 5 children. His relationship with his mother, Adelaide Allen Brown, was particularly special. This is a photo of Sterling, we think, when he was about 5 years old. This is his mother, who was a valedictorian from Fisk University. Adelaide taught in DC public schools for 50 years. She spent countless hours after school with her daughters and Sterling, reading classical literature, classical music, and encouraging them to write. As a result of Sterling's exposure to the classics, Robert Frost, as many of you may know, became one of Sterling's favorites and very influential to his later poetry writing. He actually wrote some of his poems in the style of Robert Frost. Nurtured through Adelaide's influence, as a young boy, Sterling created a very touching booklet. This is the cover of the booklet, and a personal poem for his mother, already showing the musical notes and subtle irony that would later characterize his works. He included a picture of himself. I think he was around 11 years old at the time. And the poem reads, "Oh, mother dear, let us never part. I love you with all my heart. You give me bread and butter and tart. Oh, mother dear, how sweet thou art. Oh, mother dear, let's love to the end. Let me be your faithful friend. Let us everything always lend. Oh, mother dear, what a friend." By little Sterling Brown. And certainly their closeness lasted throughout his mother's life. This is a picture of Sterling and his mother and Daisy in her later years. Now, Sterling's father, Sterling Nelson Brown, was a minister and Howard University professor of divinity for 25 years. They actually lived, as many of you know, on the Howard campus. He created an intellectual and spiritual foundation that influenced Sterling's entire life. His father wrote a memoir called My Own Life Story, which tells about how he overcame his experiences as being enslaved as a child to graduate from Fisk University and then the Oberlin Theological Seminary. Sterling's parents passed down the gift of storytelling, teaching him about race relations, about slavery, and resilience, really building a sensitivity into him about the history of Black people at an early age. They created an environment rich in intellect, faith, and culture, and you can see this influence in the poem that he wrote called Kentucky Blues, which draws from his father's stories. "I'm Kentucky born, Kentucky bred, gonna brag about Kentucky till I'm dead. Thoroughbred horses, handsome fast, I ain't got nothing but a damn jackass." Sterling was greatly loved and spoiled by his sisters, all 5 of whom became teachers, carrying on the family's educational legacy. Their summers at the family farm in Laurel, Maryland, would later be woven into his poetry. This is a photo of Sterling at the farm. And then photos of my father, Jack, as a young boy at the farm, with his grandfather, kind of got cut off, they didn't have good photographers in those days, with Sterling and Nelson Brown behind Jack. Many of you are familiar with Sterling's poem, After Winter, which gives a glimpse into the exuberance of their life on the farm and also references his sisters. The lean months are done with, the fat to come, his hopes, winter wanderers, hasten home, butter beans for Clara, sugar corn for Grace, and for the little fella, run in space. Now, when Daisy married into the Brown family, born in Southern Virginia, also of a formerly enslaved mother, she brought her own family stories from the era of slavery. She was an avid gardener and nature lover, and she brought a sensitivity and a nurturing aspect to Sterling's life. These narratives enriched Sterling's understanding and added new dimensions to his work, deepening his authenticity and poignancy in his work. It was love at first sight for both of them. It truly was a romantic story, and Daisy was truly his muse. You can see this influence in poems like Virginia Portrait, which references his times with Daisy in Southern Virginia. Warm friends, the love of her full-blooded spouse, quiet companionship as age crept on him, laughter of babies, and their shrewd, sane raising. These simple joys, not poor to her at all. The sight of smoke clouds pouring from the flue, her stalwart son deep busied with book larnin'. After the weary fields, the kettles purr in duet with the sleek and pampered mouser, twanging of Dominicers, lowing of Betsy, old folk songs chanted underneath the stars. Sterling's relationship with his son Jack was particularly special. Jack accompanied Sterling on his research trips through the South in the late 30s and 40s when he was in his teens and early 20s. These journeys not only strengthened their bond, but provided Sterling with experiences and encounters that would shape his writing. As any parent knows, having a child really changes your perspective on life. And we can see this tenderness reflected in Sterling's work in those years, particularly in pieces like Mill Mountain, which is a poignant reference to both Jack and Daisy. What has become at last my frightened child of that brown city that we knew by day? What of its squalor, of its pettiness? What of its blatant noises and its dirt? Its crying children and its fretting grind? And hectic love close pent in sultry rooms? What matter those things here where there's peace and cleanliness, where a bright moon looks down untroubledly from a rich blue sky, where winds that set the lofty cedar tops to creaking and whisper in the underbrush are all the sounds that break our quietude, my musing. These family foundations shaped not only Sterling's work, but created lasting memories for the next generations. As a family, we visited Sterling and Daisy every weekend at their house, sometimes both Saturdays and Sundays. So I'd like to share with you some of our fondest memories. Picture their house with its welcoming entrance right next door to his sister's. We'd have conversations across the porch railings, creating this wonderful sense of family connection. Here's a typical Sunday gathering on the front landing. We'd have picnics and holiday meals in the backyard, surrounded by Daisy's beloved rose garden, which she and Jack spent cultivating together. Inside the house, Sterling always had a new word game ready when we arrived. The whole family would engage in solving riddles and logic puzzles. It was amazing watching Sterling and Daisy tackle the Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle together. They were lightning fast, kept a record of their best time, and always tried to beat it. Other times he'd read quietly with us or just relax in conversation, like this quiet moment with my sister Joanne. Occasionally he would pull books from his extensive library to support the discussion, and he always knew exactly where to go to get just the right book. The professor in him was always teaching, though he did it so naturally we never noticed we were learning. But Sterling wasn't always serious intellectual pursuit. He had this wonderful, fun, playful side, and we can still picture him dancing in the living room to Duke Ellington, pipe in mouth, one of the many pipes at Williams, wearing his short plaid robe over his pants, performing a poem like Puttin' on Dog. He'd have us all laughing and dancing along. Look at old Scrappy, putting on dog, putting on dog, putting on dog. Look at old Scrappy, putting on dog, stepping like nobody's business. He'd be dancing, he'd maybe go around the hall 2 or 3 times, and we'd be following him around in a line. It was a lot of fun. In the winter, Sterling would create magical moments around the fireplace in the living room. One of our favorite traditions was when he'd perform Slim in Hell. He wouldn't just read it, he would actually bring it to life. Standing before the crackling fire, again pipe in hand, he'd transform into each character, his voice shifting dramatically from Slim's crafty drawl to the devil's booming pronouncements. We'd sit mesmerized as he acted out every scene, his expressions and gestures as colorful as his words. It was like having our own private theater, watching a master storyteller at work. Each performance was different, showing how a single poem could take on new life through the art of delivery. I'm not so sure about my sisters, but I know my favorite stanzas were at the end, when even as a young kid, I completely understood the satire. And Slim say, "Peter, I really can't tell. The place was Dixie that I took for hell." Then Peter say, "You must be crazy, I vow. Where in hell d'you think hell was, anyhow? Get on back to the earth, 'cause I've got to fear you's a little too dumb for to stay up here." These fireside performances taught us that poetry wasn't just words on a page. It was meant to be lived, breathed, and shared with joy, humor, and fun. He had simple pleasures too. Lorna Doone, vanilla cookies and vanilla ice cream were his favorite desserts. Music was always part of our gatherings, whether it was gospel, jazz, blues, ragtime, played on everything from the old family Victrola, which we still have, to the reel-to-reel tape player. Many of our family traditions grew from Sterling's own childhood experiences. Just as he played board games and piano with his sisters, he created similar moments of joy and learning for us. He filled our visits with both entertainment and education. But these cherished family moments weren't just limited to immediate family. On any given day, the rotary phone would ring, you'd hear Daisy pick up and say, "Hello, we're here, come on over," and we never knew who would drop by for a visit. We see many people who are here in the audience today, and other students and contemporaries. Sometimes we would walk around the corner to visit their friends, Ulysses and Vivian Lee, who lived behind them. Ulysses was also Sterling's co-editor of the Negro Caravan. As children, we saw these visitors as family friends, and only later understood the significance of seeing people in the living room like Duke Ellington, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, and Lena Horne. These traditions continue today. We still gather as a family for storytelling sessions. We still engage in word games and puzzles. We still share music across our generations. And the critical thinking skills that Sterling taught us, the appreciation for language and culture he instilled, and the importance of family bonds he emphasized, these continue to shape our family's younger generations. Sterling's lived experiences profoundly improved his writing and teaching style as a storyteller, focusing on the Black experience in the South. But his work as a collector and archive of Black culture wasn't just academic, it was personal. He was actively participating in the preservation and transmission of Black cultural heritage within his own family circle. He showed us that family is about maintaining connections, preserving stories, and passing down knowledge and love to future generations. His legacy wasn't just in his poems and academic works. When we read his poetry today, we don't just see the professor or the poet, we see the son who loved a writing poem to his mother, the father who traveled the South with his son, and the family man who danced in the living room. On a very personal level, I would like to reflect how this event would have meant to my parents, Jack and Betty Dennis, and to Sterling and Daisy. It's really remarkable to think that we're approaching the 100th anniversary of the first publishing of one of Sterling's poems and the release of Southern Road. I can personally remember as a child attending so many events and activities with Sterling and Daisy, hearing him speak, read, and interact with students in audiences large and small. Even today, I come across Sterling in my everyday life. Just a few weeks ago, I worked with Washington, D.C. government, and I was walking down the halls of one of their office buildings, the Office of Unified Communications. We were walking at a pretty steady clip, and saw some pictures along the wall in the corner of my eye, and I literally came to a halt and backed up because those were photos of Sterling in his living room and reading some of his poetry. I couldn't believe that even in a government building, Sterling has a presence. So it was really, really touching to see him there. It gave me an opportunity to educate some of my coworkers as well about my grandfather and his legacy. Those types of experiences are really forever engraved in my memory. Sterling touched so many lives, so many people known and unknown, and my parents worked until their dying days to ensure the legacy of Sterling's work and family history was and will be preserved and protected for generations to come. So I'm so forever grateful to Williams, to people like Jonetta and Ethelbert Miller for continuing to keep Sterling alive. They would all be so heartwarmed to be here and to know that all of you are here today to continue the legacy of Sterling. Thank you so much for letting me share this personal perspective of Sterling Allen Brown's life and the person that we knew and loved. And this is the legacy we continue to honor and preserve with you today. Thank you, everyone. If you don't mind, there's one thing. Oh, thank you so much. One of the things that is going to be occurring that's going to continue Sterling's legacy is the DC government is going to create a memorial garden in Sterling's name right here in Northeast at 14th and Rhode Island Avenue. It's in design phase right now. It's probably still a few years in the making. They've designated 3 artists and gardeners who are designing it. It is going to include not only flowers representative of Sterling and Daisy, like daisies and roses, but it will also include clips of his poetry and some sculpture. It will, one of the final designs is Sterling sitting on a bench, reading his poems, and it will be designed so the visitors to the garden can actually sit next to him and participate. So it's going to be very exciting. We'd love to have you all stay in touch. There is a QR code here if you'd like to learn more about it, but they are looking for additional sponsorship to continue to advocate for this garden. So I'm hoping that we can work with everyone here to continue to plan and support this garden. But that's just another continued legacy of Sterling and Daisy Brown. Thank you so much.
When Jonetta and I discussed who would be the keynote speaker at our conference today, I immediately suggested James Early. There are several reasons why I didn't hesitate in naming James. The keynote speaker should not only set the tone for the day's event, the person should have a knowledge of the subject and encourage new ways of understanding and appreciation so that we might leave here today with new equipment for living. There are a few individuals who we could define as Sterling Brown scholars. 2 are on our program today, and I thank Joanne Gavin and Mark Sanders for their research and scholarship. However, when I thought about how we are looking at Sterling Brown and African American folklore, I thought of James Early and the work he had done as a Smithsonian, helping to organize the Folklife Festival on the Mall. James Early is a former Smithsonian Institution Assistant Secretary for Education and Public Service. He was a former interim director of the Anacostia Museum. I thought of James for today's program because he was a friend of Sterling, a colleague when Brown came out of retirement to work with Howard University's Institute for the Arts and Humanities. I thought of James because we needed to answer the proverbial question, who are the folk when we talk about folklore? Whereas Sterling Brown is often associated with the Southern Road, James Early from Tallahassee understands the rural and working class people Brown writes about. Early understands the everyday ordinary people, not only in the American South, but in Cuba and South America. James Early brings an international and socialist perspective to Brown's work. Early was recently in Cuba, and one thinks of one of Brown's students, a young Leroy Jones, visiting Cuba during the early days of the Cuban Revolution and writing Cuba Libre, that important essay in his book, Home. Jones was interacting with Cubans the way Brown was interacting with Southern folks, listening and observing, capturing how they sound, the oral tradition. One might also think of Sterling Brown when one thinks of Walter Rodney, grounding with his brothers in Jamaica. Think of Big Boy or Slim Greer with dreadlocks. When James Early talks about Sterling Brown, he views him not just as a poet or literary critic, but as a social historian. As our keynote speaker, we look to James to cast a big net of ideas, to embrace us throughout this day. James, as perhaps the James in Percival Everett's philosophical novel, James. James Early, you are my huckleberry. My only concern with James being our keynote speaker today was whether he would be in the town. The man has more passports than Jason Bourne. So we are blessed by his presence here today. A man who moves and thinks beyond the borders and boundaries. It is my pleasure to introduce one of our intellectual strongmen, James Early.
Good morning. Sterling Allen Brown, yesterday, today, tomorrow. In the 20-minute time allotment for this opening keynote, I will address and emphasize a few of the foundational topics that emerged in pre-conference discussion for reading back to the life of Sterling Allen Brown, to foster among specific audiences today for whom this conference is designed to engage and to inspire, to activate the spirit of Sterling Allen Brown in their creative, scholarly, and educational work, and social justice lives, especially among Black folk and all of humanity. I'm mindful today that we're living in a moment of racist, authoritarian fascism in a city that Sterling Brown loved so much. And I hope I will have a little time at the end of this to speak to some of the concerns of Sterling. I must say that I was surprised, somewhat excited, anxious, and intimidated, all in one flashing moment when I received the invitation call from Jonetta Rose Barras to give the opening conference keynote. Why me, I quietly wondered, even as I was pleased to be invited. I was not one of Sterling Brown's students, nor am I a literary scholar or poet. Doing a follow-up conference prep session, co-coordinators, curators, Jonetta and Ethelbert Miller, stated that I was invited to speak because I knew and worked with Sterling Brown, and so did many others, I quietly thought. Indeed, I did work with and engage Sterling Brown in the 1970s at the Howard University Institute for the Arts and Humanities, IAH, during an extraordinary time which Ethelbert calls a Howard University moment of renaissance. What might I offer? What would I say immediately gave me pause. So much has been serious and deep critical scholarly research and analysis and literary exaltation about Sterling has been done by literary critics, poets, and other arts and cultural scholars, some of whom, like Joanne V. Gabin, author of Sterling A. Brown, Building the Black Aesthetic Tradition, you will hear from today. The folklore of Sterling Brown emerged from the Zoom conference preparation as a defining topic for these opening keynote and perspectives and recommendations I present. Ethelbert stated, "You've been dealing with organizing the Folklife Festival," referencing the Smithsonian Institution Folklife Festival. For me, a formative and defining now lifelong endeavor, which my Atlanta, Georgia Institute of the Black World co-fellow, Southern Education Foundation co-fellow, and Howard University History Department, Ford Foundation PhD co-fellow, and professional guide and extended family sister and now ancestor, Bernice Johnson Reagan, involved me, about whom in collaborating with Sterling Brown and Folklore, you will learn later in the conference from Niani Kilkenny and Amy Horowitz. On first hearing Sterling read, I was captivated by his genuine, validating poetry and voicing, His vivid living, social, and individual grassroots for me, experientially relatable down-home feelings, scenes, and individual portraits. It was Ethelbert Miller, as I was entering the Howard University Library one day, who said, "Come and go with me. Sterling Brown is reading his poetry at the School of Engineering." Per request, I interspersed some personal background with Sterling in my citations and reflections about him and conceptions about what I refer to as the Black folk class and their lore, the body of traditions, knowledge, and experience, expressive culture in language, stories, crafts, culinary traditions, agricultural science, spiritual outlook and strivings, and so on, that form the bedrock of their existence, the lowest strata of the enslaved Africans and their descendants from slavery well into the 20th century, many culturally, spiritually uplifting and poignant dimensions still present today in the Black Belt South and rural and urban communities across the country. At his home in the office at the Institute for Arts and Humanities at Howard University, Sterling was always accessible. He liked the attention of the old and the young alike. We have a cherished photograph of our oldest son, the young Jamir Toussaint Early, at 2 years of age, as Sterling gives him a mint. We see a portrait of Sterling, quiet, patient, attentive. My family experiences with Sterling and his wife, Daisy, I suspect familiar to many who knew and interacted with him, reflects closely to the description of his contemporary Edward A. Jones, professor of French, who taught summer school with Sterling at Atlanta University in 1935. Jones wrote, "Sterling and I being both inclined toward informality, both being inclined to informality and unpretentiousness, we like to let our hair down, indulge in a little levity, light banter, and exchange jokes, and he was a master raconteur, often with a risque flavor." A description of the basic personhood of Sterling Brown I knew, which brings to mind a family anecdote, which I asked my wife Miriam permission to speak about publicly. During one of our various visits with Sterling and Daisy at their home, arriving with a bottle of 20 port that Sterling liked to sip as we talked about so many issues relating to lives and notions about Black folk, just after we entered, Sterling greeted Miriam and quipped, Riley, girl, those are some short shorts. For me, much of Sterling's characteristic poetic sonography and social and heroic individual history portraits reflected the evolutionary stages of Black folk life, dating from the socio-cultural economic history of the global expansion of the capitalist economic system and the crucial exploited and abused worker role of enslaved Africans and their descendants, perhaps no more clear than in his signature poem, Strong Men. They dragged you from homeland. They chained you in coffles. They huddled you spoon fashion in filthy hatches. They sold you to give a few gentlemen ease. They broke you in like oxen. They scourged you. They branded you. They made your women breeders. They swelled your numbers with bastards. They taught you the religion they disgraced. You sang, keep a inching along like a po-inchworm. Sterling employed the poor incher metaphor to denote the external imposed oppressive life of the most lowly Black folk under European white supremacy slavery, but observant of the interior drive motion of the po-inchworm, the earth measurer, lacking full legs and resources. He highlights that despite the dehumanizing conditions, these enslaved Africans and their descendants had interior life visions and coding of the world that activated forward motion, not defined by enslavement or material attributes, not giving in to external expressive forces, raising in song legacy, a track of inner fortitude, a vision and plan to survive and live, propelling themselves forward slowly but surely. While working as a public program humanist administrator at the National Endowment for the Humanities, I so wanted all of the Black janitorial staff of women and men to hear and see themselves in community in Sterling's poetic scenes and characters. So I invited him to do a Black History program at the National Endowment for the Humanities. I was somewhat disappointed, as I recall. He spoke a lot about Frost, Sandburg, and Whitman. Some of the program is researched, is preserved in Haile Garima's film After Winter, in which I introduced Sterling. Although the invitation to keynote was shaped significantly by my personal and professional view in association with Sterling Brown, I took a step back to think about what I might say that encompasses but opens a wider perspective for all of us to think back, think, and act now and tomorrow about and with the spirit of Sterling Brown. So I reflected on a framework outlined by the late Cuban Marxist theorist, Afro-Cuban Fernando Martinez Heredia, about veneration of defining individuals, as the conference suggests that Sterling was and remains today. Fernando Martinez Heredia was founder of the theoretical Cuban Marxist journal Pensamiento Crítico, Critical Thought, the second edition of which I encountered in 1969, my senior year at Morehouse College in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Office in Atlanta, Georgia. Fernando, in his article, La normalidad no gusta de los grandes, normality does not like the great ones, pointed out what I think is a useful approach for old and new public audiences, scholars, students, to both celebrate and explore relevance and application of the life, poetic artistry, scholarship, and in my experience, the little emphasized anti-racism justice commitment, I think an untapped legacy of Sterling Brown to contemporary lives of Black folk and Black people in particular, and to all of humanity. Fernando was writing about the living spirit of the deceased iconic figure Che Guevara. The only relevance I suggest on this occasion is that he and Sterling both shared individual and social justice character and independent-minded critical thinkers, and their penchant to speak their minds without deference to official procedures or rules governing affairs. Fernando writes, "There is the first problem with Che, very little heard, very little read. It's like he's suspended in the air. It's still Che, but he's not acting. It's a serious problem." He writes further, "I want to start from there and mention at least the problem of the posterity of the people of the greatest human beings. The posterity of the greatest human beings is always difficult, and it is difficult for many reasons, especially for two reasons. One, they are exemplary individuals for their qualities, perhaps in an exaggerated way, but also because they see much further and want to go much further. That is, they can become quite autonomous to a large extent from their circumstances. This makes them great, but it also makes the matter very difficult. They have seen the need and have fulfilled it to think about both their circumstances and the future, and even try to share the thought, so that the thought they give us is transcendent. That is, it has possibility of serving in circumstances different from those in which it was created. Always, every study of thought has to study the conditions in which it occurs, and not only the content of thought. If not, they who study will not understand anything, and it will be very difficult to use those iconic figures. How then do we hear and read Sterling Brown yesterday and today, and the conditions of his thought, not only in the content of his unique creative poetic skills and voice, and his groundbreaking scholarly production, but today to remove him from suspension in the air of history and activate his spirit, seeing, grasping him in his and our larger sociocultural political time and circumstances. All integrated issues and questions we should reflect upon and project beyond today's conference in these perilous times that require stepping outside of accepted assumptions, presumptions, precedents, and protocols, as Sterling did by going beyond his birth middle-class right, his social class, born on the capstone Howard University, to a father formerly enslaved, subsequently a professor at the Howard University Divinity School, and with a mother who taught for 50 years in the DC public schools in a highly racist social class-bound society at a watershed moment of the emergence of an insurgent, new Negro educated, highly and impactful, talented, productive, creative class, some not, consciously rooted in and with Black folk life, not just the study of expressive art and cultural dimensions of folklore. We should be mindful to avoid suspending Sterling in the air of history and singularity emphasized or exalted disconnected portraits of him as the first, as the Dean of African American Literary Studies, as a vernacular poet, and other accurate, deserving topic-specific attributes and contributions that perhaps all too easily, frequently atomize the whole integrated being of Sterling Allen Brown. A mouthful of issues, questions, and charges before us, and a hell of a briar patch to traverse today and tomorrow, as Sterling, smiling, might have responded. Entree and answers to these complex interrelated questions I pose to avoid suspending Sterling in the air of history and distinct disciplinary inquiry are to be found in the volumes of pages by expert, highly acclaimed scholars explicating, connecting the life and times of Sterling Allen Brown, and from conference speakers today. And I will uplift from my intentional ideological and political lens a few select relevant historical citations and perspectives below, relying heavily on a highly recommended reading of Sterling A. Brown, A Umum Tribute, edited by Black History Museum Committee, introduction by Dr. Arthur Huff Fawcett, which includes illuminating commentary about the composite Sterling Brown from a range of disciplinary writers and scholar activists and cultural political movements, among them Ophelia S. Egypt, who collected some of the first interviews with formerly enslaved people, Leopold Sedar Senghor, a major theoretician, founder of the Negritude movement, poet and ideological socialist, first president of Senegal, and Eugenia Collier, the first recipient of the Gwendolyn Brooks Prize for poetry, as well as Amiri Baraka, among notable others like folklorist Alan Lomax. So let us descend from the air of history, from a gaze at the individualized or autonomous portraiture, as Sterling did, into what he called the mulch of Black folk culture, a word that conveys moldering organic material derived from living matter to insulate from the weeds of middle-class values and validated, acceptable, conventional life. Stepping into the mulch of Sterling's Black folk life, not just his documentation, and yes, his singularly acclaimed renderings of and about Black folks, assessed by Alain Locke as an even more New Negro folk poet than Langston Hughes, with regard to the creativity, language, stories, music, sentiment, and psychology, and survival and transformational strategies of Black folk, mainly in the South, leads me to consider Sterling in a global terrain, as did Leopold Senghor, another of the three major Negritude founder poets, writing about Sterling, an African perspective on Sterling Brown. Positioned Sterling as quote, as an original militant of Negritude, precursor of our movement, unquote. He concluded that both the socialists Damas and Césaire, university students promoting Negritude, and the communist advocates Etienne Leroux and René Menil, quote, benefited from Mr. Brown's work. Looking back at Sterling Brown and what Fernando Heredia set forth about the great ones, the thought that they give us is transcendent. That is, it has the possibility of serving in circumstances different from those in which it was created. I return to Arthur Huff Fawcett, who portrays the all-around integrated personhood and full humanity of Sterling Brown in his interior motivated decisions. Therein, the touchstones of Sterling Brown's sui generis poetic vision and crafting of heroic individual and social community portraits, drawn and spoken in his rendering of the characters of the likes of Calvin Big Boy Davis, Slim, and many scholars consider his alter ego. Fawcett, in tribute to Sterling, wrote, "Standing aloof from the blandishments of the Philistines, ever taking your place alongside the lowly brother, black or white, not pretending, nor fawning, nor yielding in the struggle to free mankind, always you sounded the clarion note, bending low to grasp the hand of the little man in the cotton patch, the still further down worker in the coal mine, the one stalking behind the white railway engineer, all those porters, bellhops, domestic workers, the menials, whose songs you have recorded, telling of black aspiration amidst much bourgeois doubt and neglect. But you always the certainty that these would be the instruments of the true Renaissance now a-coming. Behold today Sterling Brown's low man on the totem pole making his move," unquote. I once said to Sterling lightly, but with a degree of seriousness, that he had committed class suicide in his chosen deep association with black folk, which resonates for me in hearing and reading what I sense was Sterling's psychic, soulful tune-in to the deep feelings of black folk. I think captured quite poignantly in "Old Ma Rainey, sing your song, now you's back where you belong. Get way inside us, keep us strong." Sterling talked about going to the Academy of Black Folk. The folk touchstone, Black Folk Mulch, is a force field in Sterling's relationship and renderings of other blues people and artists, and the black folk exploited, belittled rural and urban workers whose economic relationships to white cotton, agricultural, and lumber industrialists, and white people in general, including the white folk class, illuminates life circumstances from which the lore of Sterling's poetic focus and profound individual creativity issues forth. I think for Sterling, a deep and abiding spiritual connection, perhaps transformational, that transcended intellectuality and poetic artistry. I was contracted by the Smithsonian Institution Associate Program to write a brief hand-build article about Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, two notable blues musicians. And I sought consultation with Stephen Henderson, who responded to my question about the folk, referencing Sterling Brown along the following analytical reading. When reading Sterling Brown's blues poetry, one should start with the blues man or blues woman as the predicate, the premise, and understand and appreciate and enjoy Sterling in his own committed, poetic, skilled voice. Eugenia Collier, who was in and around the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, writing about Sterling, early critical works in the Sterling Brown Umum tribute, also framed Sterling's deep respect for the black folk and their import to the race at large, their foundational dimension, a role in the overall black experience. She writes, "Perhaps the most interesting and significant aspect of early criticism was Sterling's reverence for the black folk as the founders of our art. He insisted that the writer know the people and grant them the humanity that in reality has always been theirs." As I close, I make brief reference to the authoritarian, racist, fascist siege in Washington, D.C., Sterling's beloved hometown. And I ask myself and to all of you, what should I do? What should we do tomorrow with the knowledge and appreciation of Sterling Brown manifested in this conference? For me and for you, the applied post-conference goals Jonetta and Ethelbert have planned is a guide for application. And I think about and ask myself, and also ask you, what would Sterling do in the present situation of the siege in Washington, D.C., the racism spreading across our country? Well, considered through the poetry, the research documentation, the scholarship, the personal and public good times. Who of you remember Sterling on WPFW radio broadcasting from the Pigfoot in Washington, D.C.? Sterling Brown was very consciously aware and involved in the circumstances of his time. I'm confident in saying a woke race man, an anti-racist activist, a progressive who aligned with more notable radical scholars and social justice activists, including alleged and known communists like W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, both of whom which he served on the NAACP steering committee, which, with his writings about racism in Washington, drew attention from the FBI and from the House Un-American Activities Act. I commend you to look at FBI's Digital Archives, Washington University, St. Louis. Just put it in, it's easy to be found. Just a few quick references of how Sterling Brown comes up under the House Un-American Activities Act and in the FBI files, which shows us that beyond the scholarly, artistic giant that Sterling Brown was, he was very much involved in anti-racism. He was very much involved in the expansion of humanity for us all. As Huff pointed out, it was not only about black people, but it was the low brother, black and white, that Sterling Brown stood for. Just a quick note on a few references here. 1941 to 1953, the FBI opened the file on Sterling, concerned by his apparent communism and possible violation of the Hatch Act, because he was working for the writers administration and the Roosevelt administration. But he wrote this article about racism in Washington, D.C., and they came after him to say that he was breaking the Hatch Act because he was a government employee. Confronting Sterling face-to-face in a face-to-face interview, FBI agents were treated to a lengthy discussion of Brown's opinions on art, race, and American democracy. Quote, "I've gotten, I suppose, the reputation as a radical because of my position on the race matter in America," Brown proudly concluded in his discussion with the FBI files. There's also a reference here to Jacques Roman, who was the Haitian writer alleged to be a communist. And because Sterling was involved with the new masses in celebrating the birthday of W.E. Du Bois, and on some of the progressive and radical social justice committees, he was attacked by the FBI. So as we think about Sterling Brown today, not only in genre, not only as a giant intellectual, let's also think about him as a citizen who was engaged in the circumstances of his time, beyond his own class background and beyond the university and academic arenas that he was involved. So I close by returning to Fernando Heredia to prompt us today and for tomorrow about the great ones, as was and is Sterling Allen Brown, and our responsibility to activate his spirit, to bring it down from the clouds of history. They have seen the need and have fulfilled it to think about both their circumstances and the future, and even try to share that thought, so that the thought they give us is transcendent, that it has a possibility of serving in circumstances different from those in which it was created. Always, every study of thought has to study the conditions in which it occurs, and not only the content of the thought. If not, they who study it will not understand anything, and it will be of very little use to them or us. Thank you.
I'm going to try not to do running commentary. It's sort of my nature, but so I'm going to try not to do it, but I do want to say how much I appreciated the presentation of Laura Dennis. I mean, it was just outstanding, and to see Sterling, little Sterling, right? And so now you really have a full picture of the man, of the human being, and she went through such great lengths to get these photographs. I was really moved when I saw them. She and I had a Zoom and she showed them to me. And when I see them again, I'm moved again, because you really do get a feel that this is someone who was thoroughly engaged from a very young age through his death, and we are still benefiting from that engagement. Also, there were a couple of things that James mentioned that I took the notice. Did anybody catch where James actually sounded like Sterling at one point? Did he practice that or what? I was surprised no one applauded him for that. But anyway, I thought his point about the House on Un-American Activities is something we should understand about poets. You are a poet. You are supposed to be engaged in the world. And that is the legacy of Sterling Brown. Always engaged at all these different ways. You will see from this exhibition the lovely photographs that we got from Williams College. We were able to, Williams Special Collection, I apologize, Williams Special Collection, we were able to actually show some of the kinds of things he did, but I was very moved by the photographs from the South and the ordinary people. And that is one of the things that triggered what we wanted to do here, and is to sort of make sure that people understood the way Sterling Brown elevated ordinary people to a level of elegance and substance. And I don't think that we really appreciate that. And that is one of the things we want to try to inspire young people who are writing to look in their communities and see the people who are around them and see them as cultural contributors with value, with importance to our society and our future. And that's one of the things I think that James did a good job of giving you all these different levels of how he was involved, and that special involvement with the Federal Writers Project that actually, I think, got him in a lot of trouble. It really did. And I always said, I think I mentioned this to Ethelbert, I think Sterling Brown was the first victim of book banning. I think that's why his second book didn't get published, was because of all this political activity, and he just couldn't help himself because that is who he is. He was involved with his people. He saw what was happening, and he had to say and had to be engaged.